Chapter 18, Suffering on the Trail. Charles, Hal, and Mercedes were full of energy and excitement. Their dogs were just the opposite. The team was still dead weary from the work with the mail sled. As the days went by, Buck realized there was another problem. His owners did not know how to do anything to maintain a successful life on the trail. What was worse, they did not learn. It took them half the night to pitch their messy camp and half the morning to break it and get the sled loaded. On the trail, they had to stop constantly to rearrange their load so it would ride correctly. Some days they did not make it even 10 miles. Hal had figured out the amount of dog food needed based on a certain number of days on the trail. It soon became apparent that they were far behind schedule and that the dog food would not last. Since none could be bought until the next town, there was only one solution. Each dog got only half the ration he was accustomed to. It was well known that dogs imported to the north had to have much more food than the native huskies, but Hal persisted in cutting down. This half ration led to the starvation of 6 dogs bought in Skagway on the day they left. And though his teammates were dying, Buck continued to pull loyally. His owners were doing even worse than the team. At first, Mercedes had wept over the dogs and had fed them on the sly. But soon her own problems took all her attention. She and her husband and brother quarreled all the time. Mostly it was over the work, each accusing the other of not doing his share. From there, the quarrels would bring up old family problems concerning people thousands of miles away or even dead. They even argued over differences of opinion on art and politics. While the fighting was going on, no one worked. Precious hours needed to set up or break camp were lost in the trading of angry words. Mercedes also found that the change in the way she was being treated was too much to bear. All her life she had been used to acting like a helpless woman. It was the custom in Virginia for women to be spoken to gently and charmingly and to be taken care of by men. Now the rude words and harsh treatment from her menfolk were a shock. She struck back by insisting on riding in the overloaded sled. Hal and Charles pleaded with her. They rightly pointed out that her 120 pounds would be the last straw for the weak and starving team. But she won out. After several days, the weak, starving animals finally fell down. The sled stood still. After begging and ordering Mercedes off the sled with no result, the men simply lifted her off. She let her legs go limp like a spoiled child and sat down on the trail. The men continued on their way, but she did not move. After they had traveled 3 miles, they gave in and returned for her. They lifted her back on the sled and inched along. This was also the day that the dog food finally gave out. Buck staggered along in a nightmare. He pulled when he could. When he could no longer pull, he fell down until blows from a club or whip drove him to his feet. All the stiffness and gloss had gone out of his beautiful furry coat. His hair hung down, limp and draggled, or matted with dried blood where Hal's club had bruised him. Each rib was outlined clearly through his loose hide. The team looked like skeletons creeping along. One by one they fell and could not rise. Hal was forced to kill 3 of them to end their suffering. Only Buck and 4 other dogs remained as they pulled up beside a one-man camp near the White River. It was spring and the trees and ice alike were thawing and bending and snapping. When the team stopped, the dogs fell where they were as if dead. Mercedes was crying as usual. The 2 men were staggering from their weariness and disillusionment. The owner of the camp was sitting on a log, whittling the last touches on an axe handle he had made from a stick of birch. Buck lifted his exhausted head and saw John Thornton for the first time. Chapter 19. Buck is rescued. Thornton sized up the three people for the arrogant tenderfeet they were. When Hal asked about the condition of the ice, Thornton had simply replied, "Rotten." But Thornton knew they would ignore this advice, and they did. Hal gave a skeptical smile. "That's what we heard 2 days ago, that the bottom was dropping out of the trail. Some men told us we wouldn't be able to make White River, and here we are," he boasted triumphantly. "Those men were right," said Thornton. "The bottom's likely to drop out at any moment. Only a lucky fool could have made it here. Me, I wouldn't go out on that ice on the river for all the gold in Alaska. My advice is stay put." "Don't you worry about us," said Hal with a slight sneer. "Some of us are a little braver than others. It wouldn't surprise me a bit if we didn't pull into Dawson before you know it, rotten ice or no rotten ice." He uncoiled his whip and shouted, "Get up there, Buck! Hi, mush on!" But the team did not get up. Hal bore down with his whip. John Thornton's lips tightened, but he didn't speak. Sol-leks was the first to crawl to his feet. Joe made 2 painful tries and fell over each time. On the 3rd try, he managed to stand. Buck made no effort. He lay quietly where he had fallen. The lash bit into him again and again, but he neither whined nor struggled. Several times Thornton started to speak, then stopped himself. This was the first time that Buck had failed, and it drove Hal into a rage to have it happen before this trail-wise stranger. He threw down the whip and used a club on Buck. Like the other dogs, Buck could just about have managed to get up. There was one difference. Buck had made up his mind not to get up. He had a vague feeling of doom. All day he had noticed thin, rotten ice under his feet. Now he strongly sensed disaster if he went back to the icy river, so he refused to stir. So greatly had Buck suffered, and so near death was he, that the blows from Hal's club did not hurt much. Buck felt strangely numb, but he was aware that the club continued to fall heavily. His life was flickering out. His eyes were closing. Suddenly, without warning, there was a furious cry, more like an animal than a man's. It was John Thornton. He sprang at Hal and knocked him down with one blow. Standing over Buck, Thornton spoke to Hal in a voice thick with rage. "If you strike that dog again, I'll kill you." "It's my dog," said Hal, rising and wiping the blood from his nose. "Get out of my way or I'll fix you. I'm going to Dawson, and I'm going now." Thornton continued to stand his ground between Hal and Buck. Mercedes screamed as Hal drew out his hunting knife. But Thornton, with an easy flick of his wrist, rapped Hal's knuckles with the axe handle. Hal dropped the knife. As he dove after it, Thornton rapped his hand again even harder. But he picked up the knife himself and cut Buck's traces. Hal had no fight left in him after the strains of travel with Charles and Mercedes and their ill fortune. He decided that Buck would soon be dead anyway, so he gave in to Thornton. He picked up his knife and whip and club, then forced the 4 remaining dogs back on the icy river. Buck heard them leave, and he raised his head to see. Pike was leading with Sol-leks at the wheel. In between were Joe and Teek. They were limping and staggering. Mercedes was riding. Hal was guiding at the gee-pole, and Charles was stumbling along behind the sled. As Buck watched, Thornton knelt beside him. His rough, kindly hand searched for broken bones. By the time he had decided that Buck's problems were countless bruises and a terrible state of starvation, the sled was already on the frozen river. Buck and Thornton watched it crawling along over the ice. Suddenly, they saw its back end drop down as if in a rut. The gee-pole, with Hal clinging to it, jerked into the air. Mercedes' scream reached their ears. They saw Charles turn and take one step to run back on shore. and a whole section of ice gave away. Dogs and people disappeared. Only a huge watery hole remained. Buck finally understood what people meant when they said that the bottom had dropped out of the trail. John Thornton and Buck looked at each other. "You poor devil," said Thornton. Buck licked his hand.